Hello and welcome to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers play games from the past and discuss their impact and relevance today. I'm Tim Longo, and I'm joined, as always, by a man who is still trying to stop the voices in his head, but he just loves talking to himself.
Brett Duville.
Yeah, that was in your head. I didn't hear that, actually.
I didn't think so.
Constantly narrating your every movement.
Here I am, recording a podcast with Tim Longo. That bastard.
Yeah, I just we are playing Thief the Dark Project, though technically Thief Gold, which does have some differences.
It does, some significant ones we probably talk about at some point, but we haven't really hit them yet.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I actually haven't, though I have played Thief the Dark Project twice in the past. I think this is my third time. I have never played the gold version, so I guess some of that content will be new to me. This is a 1998 game. We were discussing a little bit in pre-show. Of course, we've played various 98 games so far. So it's very interesting to always return to this year because it's definitely one of those semi-legendary years that everyone talks about, at least of our age, who might have lived through it, including things like StarCraft, Ocarina of Time, Metal Gear Solid, which we played, Unreal, the original Unreal, Rainbow Six, Final Fantasy Tactics. Some a little bit into their series, like Resident Evil 2 and Tomb Raider 3. What were some others that we wanted to mention? Rogue Squadron, Grim Fandango. Half-Life, of course, as well. Right. And Baldur's Gate.
Half-Life being a big one for this year, for sure. And to be competitive with this game. Another one I particularly liked from that year was Spyro the Dragon, which I don't think I played this year. I think I played a couple years later, but is a game I quite liked. A series I quite liked, actually, the first few. Also that Battlezone game that we've talked about before, and Descent Free Space, which was a Starfighter influence. A lot of interesting games this year, to be honest. It's one of those banner years. When I was on the Kotaku Split Screen podcast a while back. That one of their questions was, your time at LucasArts was 1998 to 2004, and those are two big years. It was kind of interesting to think about that, of how it bookended my career with a couple of really good years, because of course Half-Life 2 in 2004, and super interesting times.
We didn't mention Fallout 2 as well, which we've played Fallout 1, and then of course Pokemon Red and Blue, which I totally missed on the list as well.
That's a good one to point out. Pokemon
Yellow in Japan. So it's an interesting game. I think one of the things that we were discussing, specifically hitting up, and we've actually referenced this game because we've played a few stealth games already. We've referenced this game a few times, I believe, for some of the games that have followed, and what we would predict are some of its influences, I would say, some of the things that have influenced those other games. And this was one of those weird games that I think we all kind of generally recall, though Brett had just started right in the industry, but I'm sure we were all talking about it. We kind of all recall sort of the sort of unorthodox nature of the game in a world where the Quakes and the Unreals, and you have Epic and id kind of leading the charge, and kind of all of the studios surrounding that sort of first-person shooter culture around the time. It was very, very specific kind of thrust of what those games really meant to players, and they're all kind of riffs off of each other. Duke Nukem, and I noticed Heretic on here, and kind of they're all kind of in that vein. And then this game comes out.
Unreal actually was this year as well. So the first Unreal.
And then this game comes out completely a little bit out of the blue, and so different, with completely different goals from all the others, in a pretty, what I felt like I remember thinking at the time and talking about with people at the time, in a pretty bold manner, really kind of bucking the trend. And it'd be interesting to talk to somebody from IDOS at the time. And I wonder what those conversations were like from a publisher perspective, because, the pitch, and some, playing an early version of the game or prototype or something, it being so different and so just from a pacing perspective and a mechanics perspective from anything else out there. And, I would have considered it a pretty risky project at the time because it was so bucking the norm. But I think because of that, it stood out as something pretty special and different at the same time. And we talked similarly, I think, about Metal Gear for various different reasons, but also some similar reasons of pacing and just a different kind of genre being thrown out there in a world of action games where it's always go, 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 and these two games in particular were kind of the opposite, and I think that's why it stood out for me as a player at the time, for sure. Just like, wow, it's pretty gutsy.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that comes up that's kind of interesting looking into this game is that it was originally, when they were trying to figure out what the game was going to be, it was originally going to be a first person sword fighting simulator. I mean, that was going to be kind of the big deal thing. Interestingly enough, that game sort of, not exactly that game, but a game that's not too far from that came out this year as well. And that's Die by the Sword. I don't know if you remember that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Treyarch's, one of Treyarch's first games, maybe their first game.
I didn't know.
Certainly early. There was Treyarch. Yeah, certainly one of their very early titles. I don't remember whether it was their very first title. Probably not. No, apparently not. They had one other game that also came out this year. So who knows? Maybe it was sort of their first title. Certainly their first PC title. Yeah, and that was a game that kind of came out and disappeared because of its difficult control style. You had sort of full control. It was sort of like what's Trespasser, the Jurassic Park thing, where you had a lot more control over how the arm was going to work, and it made it very, I think, very difficult for that to.
I remember playing it. Yeah.
I don't think it quite found the success that it may have been seeking, just because it really was kind of a push in a difficult direction and a hard sell. I think one of the things you've already alluded to is the pacing that this game has, and any sort of, even a sword fighting game is probably going to have, especially if you got to kind of fine control it like that one does. So this is a game where the central feeling, the central wish fulfillment is to be a thief, and choosing to do that in the first person is not an obvious move in 1998, particularly because of the pacing, which is something that we talked about pre-show. It's not a fast-paced game by any means, because it's not it's not a game where you're highly lethal. The enemies are highly lethal in most cases, but you yourself are not. So you're not really on an even footing with the guards. They have armor, you do not. They I guess they probably attack a little faster. Certainly their attacks do more damage. They can kill you in a few hits, even on the lowest level of difficulty. Difficulty setting is something we'll probably talk about later, but as you go up in difficulty settings, you are required not to kill the guards, or not to be ever seen by them, and things like that. So it's definitely pushing a very different, much more methodical experience.
Well, and I would say that it also just it disincentivizes and also just punishes you for trying to play in any action oriented way. And I've been definitely, without jumping ahead too much, I've been definitely playing and in my usual sloppy way for the podcast and not trying to save scum too much. And so in my two previous I think one of my playthroughs, my second playthrough, I think I played on expert, which took me forever, as I recall, because it's just, you have to be very meticulous about it and methodical. And so this time, as I often do, because we're speeding through these games a little bit, I'm kind of just, taking it as it comes. And if you are sloppy and you are kind of trying to run and gun a little bit, the game really pushes back in a very hard way, and enemies stack up, and it just becomes nearly impossible to proceed. So that I remember those conversations at the time for people, because we were all playing all those action oriented FPSs, and the people that really, to be honest, hated this game were the ones that just wanted to go in and sword fight their way through things, and were punished for doing so. I think we didn't in our very minimal amount of research, I don't think we saw any numbers on this game, but I can't imagine it doing crazy numbers when it comes to sales and stuff. It was just very niche when it comes to the fantasy fulfillment of it, but the pacing alone, I think, I don't remember if there was a demo for the game or anything, but at the time
there was, in fact, a demo at the time. Yeah, I can remember, and we can take a little sidebar into this, but this was a game where I was really looking forward to this one. I used to keep track of when games were coming out, and this was one I was really looking forward to, and this was a day one purchase for me. I remember the demo coming out, and I'm sure it was on like a PC mag type thing, and I was playing it in my office. Back then I would play, things at lunch or whatever. I was totally focused on the demo. Darren Stinnett, who we've had on the show, came in through the door, which my desk directly faced, and walked in and then walked around behind me and waited for me to lean into the screen and be totally absorbed, and then just like grab me by the shoulders.
I feel
freaked me out.
I feel like you've told this story before, but maybe you've just told me.
No, that was the System Shock 2 story at home where my.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, you're easy to scare when you're playing games. Apparently.
Yeah, surprisingly,
time again.
So what I'm reading, looking into this a little bit more, is this is actually their most successful title.
Looking Glass.
Yes.
Oh wow! Interesting.
Over time. So I don't think that it came out with a bang, although the numbers I'm seeing are pretty close together. It's probably going to need a little more research to see if this is actually accurate, because there's two numbers that are a month apart, and the sales numbers are vastly different. So it's really interesting. Yeah, I'll have to track that down. Weird.
Yeah.
So
interesting. Yeah, I mean that's kind of cool to hear. It's a testament to the bucking the trend sort of concept, though, because perhaps it did so well in its sort of, I don't know if niche is too unfair of a way to describe it, but in those of us who found it and really kind of reveled in how different it was, it kind of stood out more, of course, right? Because it's just so different, and versus say Quake and Unreal, fighting for number one spot and both trying to basically cannibalize each other for so many years, etc. And Doom. So yeah, it's just very unique and very, and I definitely remember, like we talked about with Metal Gear, and me being over time discovering that I was such a stealth game fan, because stealth games weren't really a thing until these games started coming out, and kind of, just like you were saying, kind of just being fully engrossed and being amazed at how patient of a game it really, was, and loving that full commitment to it, because I think you definitely see Thief and stealth-based mechanics from Thief in various places, but it's intermixed within a lot of other gameplay mechanics and gameplay systems and things that are going on. But not a lot fully commit like this, and as Brett said in pre-show, really nothing since, either. You definitely have some lineage in the Hitman games and Metal Gear and Splinter Cell, and those definitely keep going. But the irony of those, especially in some of those later versions of those examples like Splinter Cell and Metal Gear, they actually got more and more actiony and got better at the action, and so if you wanted to play a certain actiony way in those games, in the modern versions of those games, you could, versus say, these games that really never really took that on. Though I do have to admit, I didn't play the reboot. that Eidos Montreal put out. So I don't know how actiony that one ended up being. I could completely see them falling into the trap, though, of trying to accommodate any type of play style. Though I think we probably won't talk about it too much of this episode. Maybe toward the end, I'm sure Dishonored will come up more and more.
Sure,
because that'll be an interesting one to talk about how they potentially, how they balanced those sorts of play styles, and maybe, I don't know, maybe that's a good bonus episode now that I think about it. Even though I know you've played both of them.
I have, but I'm certainly willing to go back into that particular area. I love those games for sure. In fact, I never did finish my second high chaos playthrough of Dishonored 2. So,
it's interesting to talk about how they solved that.
Yeah, I got the gold.
Yeah,
or the
trophy.
Whatever, the platinum. Yeah, the
platinum. Yeah,
the whole. I got them all.
It's it's just a funny. It's definitely always fun to come back to some of these games that I've played before and really play in a more carefree way, because I'm definitely pushing the boundaries of what the game offers when you don't play the way they want you to. If you know what I mean. And
sure, yeah.
I've definitely had probably, I would say, 8 to 10 guards in one room, all trying to get to me in
my goodness.
In that last level that we played, the prison, because they don't, they have a long memory, as opposed to a lot of modern stealth games that kind of reset. They kind of just keep looking for you. So, but anyway, that's a detail.
For sure. We should probably, while we're here, we should probably talk a little bit as well about Looking Glass itself. Looking Glass, to me, is one of those game developers. Not necessarily the most successful out there, but one of those that I think people tended to play, and it was because of this. People who are in the industry tended to play and really admire for a number of reasons. One was their technology was often quite good, especially considering their size, and the choices that they made to do the things they did are interesting. They were not licensing engines to do these things. So although their name changed, this is basically the same entity. The titles I'm going to mention, there are some others, but Ultima Underworld, they were Blue Sky Productions working on that, but it was a sort of co-production with Origin. Then they did the sequel as Looking Glass Technologies, Ultima Underworld 2, the original System Shock, Flight Unlimited 1 and 2 are big ones. Terra Nova, Strike Force, and Centauri. I never played that. But then, of course, also Thief, The Dark Project, System Shock 2 they have a credit on, as we talked with Ken Levine about, because they basically were sort of publishing and giving a little bit of support to. And then, of course, Thief 2. There are other titles in here. They did 3 Flight Unlimited games from what I'm seeing. Some other interesting titles that you're like scratching your head a little bit. But as I recall, they sort of had 2 teams, and one team was doing the flight sims in the other games, and the other was doing the sort of immersive sims. And I think you could arguably say that they were there when it was born. So yeah, it's certainly an interesting. It's an interesting history. It was also based in Massachusetts, so it's close to my heart because it was not far from where I grew up. Although by the time they were making games, I was long gone.
Yeah, I mean it's one of, for this era, and I would say for many of us of our generation, maybe, of game developer, I think it's probably one of the most important studios. Definitely on the game design side, one of the most important studios in I think game development history. And I know that's probably seems like I'm overdoing it with those comments, but they were trailblazers in so many ways, whether completely intentional or not. And they had such an interesting mixture of personnel that kind of, when they dissolved, spread out to do all sorts of different things. And I think if you were to make a sort of, some sort of flow chart about where people went, and how it kind of spread, you would definitely see so many direct connections and obvious, like, aha, of course, kind of things, because those people went on and they kind of took a very, what seems like, when we've talked to the few of them and some of them that we know, they took all a very common understanding and knowledge base of how they all felt about video games, and they were all seemed to be so much on the same page with each other that once they started spreading out, they took those tenets with them and then started spreading them out, to other people, even if, for people that they worked with, but even people they didn't work with. And, the Harvey Smiths, the Randy Smiths, the Mark LeBlanc, Doug Church, Warren, of course, and then, of course, Paul,
Ken Levine and Paul Neurath, who's doing Underworld Descendant right now, and Emil Pagliarulo, with whom I worked at Bethesda, was
I didn't know that.
Last person on Thief 2: The Metal Age. Now I don't know if he was. I'll have to look up and see, because I remember when I talked to Emil about that. I don't remember. I don't remember what he did on it, but I definitely remember saying, "Oh my God, I've been a Emil Pagliarulo fanboy my whole life," because of that for sure. So, yeah.
Well, and Paul Neurath, who we talked about for the Underworld series, he was probably in sort of an EP role or studio head role, right at the time, and I think he founded
Looking Glass, I believe. So
I think he's famously the one who basically got them to focus on the Thief fantasy. The focusing on that. He was the one that was sort of like, let's because they were, as Brett was saying, they had some early versions of this game were attempting to do a couple different things, and it was kind of a much broader game doing multiple things, and I think he was the one that said, hey, let's just focus on the Thief part and see if we can make a game focused on that fantasy, that wish fulfillment, as Brett mentioned, and then they hit upon that, and then Lulu Lamar also was somebody who came over to Crystal. Doug Church had a stint at Crystal as well, so even Crystal Dynamics had some of that impact from this group. It's just interesting.
And then of course Tim Stelmach, who we've mentioned on the cast in the past. We were talking in pre-show about Terry Brosius and Eric Brosius, who are writer and composer on the game, who have also worked on Dishonored. But then in particular, the project's director was Greg Lopiccolo, who was one of the founders of Harmonix. So this is just, it's one of those studios that just, and even this game, you could kind of look and see its tendrils kind of reach throughout the industry. From even just a pure, these folks have kind of gone on and their names are still pretty well known in most cases. So it's super interesting to look at that stuff again.
Yeah. Shifting gears really quickly, I think the other sort of macro topic that I want to throw out there that I really appreciated about this one, and I think we talked some about it with System Shock 2 as well, though I would say this one goes even further. The sort of overall mood and tone and just style of the game was just so fully committed to as well. The main character is very memorable, and in my intro, I was making fun of his constant talking to himself and narration and kind of inner monologue, though he's probably technically not talking to himself in the game. It's more of an inner monologue.
Brett thought that Tim had been going on a little too long.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, probably set myself up for just a whole host of problems for this series now. He's going to keep doing that. But I also remember as a player just the mood and tone of this thing, even the cutscenes were very different from other stuff coming out. I don't think that they would get necessarily the credit for, the first ones to do the sort of painterly / illustrative, cutscenes that were kind of a mixture of 2D and some 3D shots, and just very stylized. But they were one of the early ones I remember as a player being really impressed by, doing a sort of more hand-drawn kind of look and very artistic in general. And that sort of whole and the another example of that is the map design specifically too, which we'll get into probably more details as we play. They just fully committed to that stuff, and it just is a really well realized, fully realized sense of place, you know. And we'll get into fiction stuff later and such. But the character Garrett, like, just very memorable, and his voice is great. You know, the voice acting was wonderful, and the writing too. I would say the writing is just really on point with what they're trying to do, and it just paints this whole picture in a tonal way that very memorable and has a very signature look and feel, and that isn't like much else out there as well. Even medieval stuff, you know, a lot of the RPGs out there were still pretty kind of high fantasy and very kind of grand, you know, in nature. If you think about something like Baldur's Gate that came out the same year, and kind of the epic quality of the Dungeons and Dragons. And this is really just kind of more of a personal story of this one thief, you know, going through. I mean, he even talks about paying rent, you know, and and like getting by, you know, and a little bit of his origin story and the mystery behind some of the lore and stuff. So that's another kind of.
And so you didn't play the tutorial level, which I think
did. No,
if you. Oh, you did? Okay. So if you don't, so I was, because that's skippable. I'm not sure that you would get the sort of little introduction you get to Garrett as a kid, where you kind of get to understand how he kind of came by all these toys, basically. He was trained by these keepers, and they kind of move silently through the world. It's a great intro to some of the lore from the world, but not in a sort of dumpy way of just, here's a bunch of stuff to read. There are occasions where you have to, where if you're inclined, you can read it, but it's very functional. There is this shadowy group that most people don't even notice when they walk through a crowd, and they bring in this orphan and train him because he noticed them. And so there's some hints that he's somehow special, and or just especially talented. So yeah, it's a pretty extraordinary thing. I did want to, since you were talking about the voice acting, Stephen Russell was the voice actor.
Yeah, the name rings a bell. Yeah, I feel like, do you have the info on anything else he's done? Because I feel like he had done a bunch of other things at that era that we would have probably remembered. But I could be wrong on that.
Yeah, I'll see if I can track down more about him.
Yeah, that's okay. But just, I mean, Garrett, at least for me personally, Garrett's one of those characters that I don't think I'll ever forget, as far as gaming goes, you know.
He played Nick Valentine apparently in Fallout 4, so who knew? He played Corvo Atano in Dishonored 1 and 2.
Oh, really? Yes. Perfect. Oh, well, there you go. There's a direct lineage right there. That was very intentional.
He played some voices in Fallout 3 and Skyrim. So apparently we share credits, this fellow and I. Didn't know that. He was also in Neverwinter Nights, Freedom Force, which is not surprising. Arx Fatalis, which is Arcane Studios' first game, by Harvey Smith and Raph. It was just Raph Calantonio then. And some characters in System Shock 2, including the Many. So yes, he's done plenty of voice work. That is for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And lots of video games. So yes, he's been all over the place. I guess I should have known that. He's even in Prey. He's even in Prey a bit. So there you go.
There you go. Yeah. So
he's one of those that I think people want to make sure they get it in. That's maybe, and he's in the Magic Circle. Oh my God, they're just dragging him into all these sort of descendant, sort of related games in some ways. So it's that's kind of funny to see that. I didn't realize that. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Once you find his voice acting really sets apart those cutscenes. I think they would not have worked.
Oh no,
without
sure.
that kind of gravitas and gravelly, and just sort of the sense that this is a person who lives on the other side of the law. He's not necessarily a bad guy. He considers himself a professional, and he, especially if you play the game on higher levels of difficulty, he's not going to kill anyone. Though you have that opportunity if you play on the normal difficulty. I think you can't. I think there's at the sort of hard level of difficulty, you cannot kill non-guards, but you can still kill guards. And then at the expert level, you cannot, can't kill anyone.
Yeah.
And that is actually how I also played the first time. The only time I've played this game, I played the very slow way. It's funny to play it now and be saving with just a quick save, and then maybe every 15 minutes make a save, when originally it would have been, I want to make sure I've got several saves deep, because at any point I might decide I really have to back up a long way because of there is sort of a clockwork nature to some of the levels, not in a super visible way necessarily, not as tightly as some other games that we've played, I don't think, but there is this sense of, well, the guards are on these patrol routes, and so if you're trying to set up a thing and maybe drag them over here with some noise or something like that, or distract them in some way, you might set things off where it now makes it actually much more difficult to get through an area, because now two guards are in sync in some way that they weren't before. So there's all kinds of things like that can happen from that come out of the systems. Do you, speaking of systems, you want to talk about the sort of moment-to-moment systems of light and audio, and compare and contrast that, and maybe that'll be our final topic for the evening.
Yeah, let's touch on that some, and we're definitely going to want to get into it very, much more meticulously later on. But to set up sort of like the high level, I think the interesting thing we were talking about in pre-show, and I alluded to a little bit earlier, is the contrast of this game and Metal Gear being in the same year, both being completely different stealth approaches, basically the stealth gameplay in very interesting ways, and of course to Brett's point about sort of like the immersive sim and Looking Glass's sort of MO, their approach being trying to really kind of, have the systems bleed very nicely into the immersion of the world and the level design and the way that everything is constructed. And so light, very explicitly light, including pretty well-defined shadows, it was also not very common at the time. Being a really important part of how the systems work, and having this concept of a light jewel that shows you very explicitly when you could be seen, and moving in and out of that, and watching that sort of quote unquote meter change as you're moving, and then also how audio impacts that. In the training level, they very explicitly have some sections that teach you both of these concepts, and how the surface of the ground impacts how loudly you're going to be, heard, the speed at which you move, and will produce louder footsteps, moving more slowly, crouching, etc. And the material on the ground, which obviously will come into play later as you kind of get some more, you technically could have seen moss arrows up to this point, but you can even impact that with some other mechanics that they give you in cool ways. And so, I think they're basically like a lot of the other games, they're setting up this rule set that you then can sort of experiment with and try to, as Brett said, from the clockwork perspective, kind of exploit and redirect and take advantage of these sort of systems, because the rule sets tend to be pretty clear. I think the thing that we don't necessarily have to dive too deeply into now, but I know is going to come up later over time, is the that I would like to get into a lot more detail about, is really the feedback and telegraphing that they don't have, and the challenges that some of they're basically presenting a bunch of different challenges that this genre is going to have in the future, and you can kind of start assessing all of those as you're playing this game, because it was one of the first, if not the first, of this style. And so you can kind of see, oh yeah, well, there is no direct feedback about what state the enemies are in, or if they can see you or can't see you, other than in this game's case, VO audio or potentially sometimes animation states. So, versus say a Dishonored, also, which is a lot more
paying attention to their facing, right? You need to, as opposed to, for example, Metal Gear Solid, where the view cones are literally shown to you on the little radar in the corner, the map, making it more of a map game, to be honest. Something that we've talked about before. This is not a map game. This is definitely, what do you see and what are you going to do with that information? Yeah.
And interpreting that, because it's definitely, because there's no view cones explicitly, there's some soft boundaries there where you're not quite sure sometimes of like, is he looking at me? Am I out of his vision? And so there's definitely a lot of save scumming going on there, because you're really not sure. So basically reloading ends up being your experimentation method, versus stressing the systems themselves. So, I think it's still a bold game and bold design, but you start seeing some of the cracks that games will start iterating and chipping away on as the years go on from here. And again, though maybe a little too, I would say for me personally as a player, a little too heavy-handed with the feedback in Dishonored. I think Dishonored is definitely one of the pinnacles of giving you clear feedback on enemy, what's going on with the enemies in this style, in the first-person style anyway. But right. Yeah. I mean, those, once they've set up those basic things, and we'll hit some more later, because there's rope arrows and wood, and there's different surface treatments that provide additional basically rule sets for the player to dabble in. So it's really the beginnings of some really cool combinations of things that really hadn't been out there.
Yeah, and I want to touch on at least the technical details, because a lot of what they're doing here is not common at this time. There's you mentioned the shadows, because they have and not all of their lights are dynamic, but because they have so many dynamic lights, they really have to figure out how to do those in a dynamic way. And these are basically the torches that are in sconces on the walls that you can shoot out with water arrows. Because any of those could just go out because of Garrett, they have to dynamically shadow those rooms, and that's a tough problem in 1998.
Right.
And not something anybody else was solving. Yeah, you definitely take it for granted. And I think maybe the light meter was additionally sort of a hedge on that, because they needed to know if the tech would be strong enough to do it. And maybe also that's also maybe a sop to the players as well, who won't have been familiar with that sort of technology even at that point, and go, am I in shadow or not? And that's just a clear way to give the player the feedback that it's there. The other is that the audio propagation model is pretty advanced for its time. This is a game that cares whether or not doors are open or closed. There's a simple distance model that has to do with how far guards can hear you. So it can be attenuated in different ways. As you've already mentioned, the different surface characteristics will change the volume of sounds and things like that. So there's a lot going on there, and that's going on for every entity in the environment, not just Garrett. So if you take a guard, for example, that you've knocked out and throw him down some stairs, his body falling makes some noise, and if you do that near enough to another guard, they will hear that as well. It's not just where's the player under the hood. It's not just where's the player and can I hear him. It's much more complicated. It's where has there been a sound made, and is that something I could hear? And it doesn't matter where that came from. It's this sort of divorcing of what typically I think game developers would have done at the time is cheat in a lot of ways and say, well, we know that the only person doing these things in the world are the player, and that's all we ever care about. And as a result, you would miss things. Here, it takes that step of saying, well, the enemy AI responds to stimuli of different kinds, and rather than saying the stimuli always come from the player, we generate the stimuli from all different sorts of things, and any one of those could cause the enemy AI to go and track things if it's not expected. So super interesting technology at the time, and of course they made their own engine, which is hard to imagine given the competition they had at the time. But they had always been on the forefront of first-person technology between Ultima Underworld and System Shock, and this maybe not the forefront technically. They probably didn't have the best looking first-person engines at the time, but they did a lot more with the cycles that they had available to them in these other ways and the systems that they had. So I thought that was all worth pointing out. The tech that was required to support those systemic choices.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I had forgotten to when you mentioned the dynamic lighting that I've just taken for granted at this point. The other thing that this game did for me personally, and I don't think I was alone. I remember talking to others about it, Reed and yourself and others. Since after this game had come out, any game that even had any even minute amount of stealth mechanics or systems in it, if you couldn't shoot out a light or take down, and change sort of like your lighting situation in a semi-stealth game, just felt like it was behind the times, because this was the game where they sort of fully committed to that, and like you said, that would require dynamic lighting to do it, and and that was so rare, and it continued to be rare, to be honest, for a while, and still today sometimes. And if you don't, it really just, no pun intended, I guess, shined a light on that problem whenever it just didn't make sense that I couldn't shoot out a light or do something to impact that if they're going to ask me to sneak around. So it's funny how kind of even that one little thing was a bit of a sea change for these sorts of systems and mechanics, which it was funny.
All right. Well, do you want to maybe put a pin in the discussion there for now and get to a little feedback, and then we can talk about what we're going to do next time?
Yeah. We didn't. We can cover these initial levels maybe next time, I guess. We don't really talk about specific levels, but we can.
If you'd like to, we could dive into them now. I know we want to keep an eye on the time, but we probably have time to talk about the levels. The tutorial itself is not super complicated, so it's not really. I don't think we really need to talk about that too much, but. Because it really is just directing you at every step. Some voice is telling you, do this, do this, do this, which is nice. And it was good because I had to rebind a bunch of keys, and it was helpful to have that to tell me, oh, yeah, okay, weird. Some weird choices in the keys, as is often the case in these earlier games, not straight WASD.
Yeah.
But then Lord Bafford's Manor, I guess, is the first sort of main full-length mission, and you want to talk a little bit about that? It's kind of just dropping you right into like, now you're doing a job.
Yeah, and I think the thing that really, it's not, there's not too many details to talk about with it, but the thing that I want to use that first level as, however intentional on their part, as a really good first level, but going back to it again after all these years for me, and just having. I think I played the game twice, but I think I started the game probably more than that. So I probably played this level, half a dozen times, if I'm honest, because I'd restarted the game so many times over the years. This level is such a good example of setting the stage for what this game is, in my opinion. There's a very clear, like they present you with, the intro presents you with your options, the intro kind of briefing. Garrett kind of talks about the sort of macro flow of it. They introduce you to this concept of finding an alternate route into whatever your area is that you're going into. And it's very clear where it is, etc. They very, very easily introduce you into pickpocketing with the guy that's by the gate who's drunk and very easy to pickpocket. And so you get this initial really cool moment, if that's how you choose to do it, which I think is probably one of the only ways you can do it, of picking his pocket and getting this key right without him even knowing it. And that fantasy fulfillment of that moment is like, boils it all down really nicely. And then you feel very thiefy, going through that gatehouse and going down underneath and getting in that way. And it feels, and then the other thing that I forgot about it that I really appreciate is once you find that alternate route, you get into the manor and then you work your way, like you're basically, when you're at the gatehouse, you're basically right, like as the crow flies, next to the scepter that you need. It's in the back of the building that's right there, and you're behind the building. It's literally right through the wall there. Mm-hmm. But you have this great flow of going underneath, basically getting to the front, but behind the gate, the open, the front gate where the guards were, and then making your way back to that, to that area in the back of the manor. So there's this great, like, fully realized, cohesive sense of this location. You know what I mean? And you start from the outside where you're not a threat. You can meet some pedestrians and they'll just say hi to you. Even the guards just say hi to you. They don't think anything of you outside, but once you go inside, you're an intruder. So it kind of sets up every little piece of the recipe. You know what I mean? Of what the paradigm of this game is going to be in this one pretty pure level, I would say. And then you get this cool, treasure at the end, and it sets up the next mission because the guy who wants it is, so I don't know. I just really appreciated the sort of, not just simplicity of it, but just how it has a little bit of every element that they'll just keep expanding upon for the rest of the game in this first initial level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, another thing that I think comes across is level, sort of the density of experience per level. I mean, one of the things that happens here, as you mentioned, since you're kind of going all the way around to the back, then going to the very bottom, and then sort of covering all the space to get up to the top floor, you're basically covering. There are some places where you can take a couple of shortcuts, I guess, but for the most part, you're covering a lot of the level, despite the fact that it is not a linear level, right? I mean, you don't necessarily have to do that, right? But it just naturally happens, I think. And that's really very excellent level design, because of course you're getting the most out of this space, which is basically, aside from the tunnels beneath, it's basically a square, right? I mean, it's a 3-level square or something like that. And they're getting a ton out of that, a lot of leverage, right? So it's extremely well done and very efficient in that way. And that's kind of admirable as well. And of course, because you've got that, those patrolling guards, there is also sort of a density of experience of just the sort of, well, I have to move slowly and I have to be careful and I have to constantly pay attention and listen, and see if I can pick anything up. And, occasionally you'll have a moment where somebody spots you and you have to react. And it's it's a real interesting space, and a great first level as a result, because I think, as you point out, all the things that you're going to see in this game are here maybe in some form. There's a couple things maybe not, like the rope arrows and the moss in particular, and some of the enemy types, obviously, but sort of the fundamental feel of this game is right there in that first mission.
Kind of the archetype
from a mechanic
of the game. Not the details maybe, but I think the only thing maybe that I'll quickly mention, and then we can take a break, of the second level, or technically third level with the prison, is I think it's a cool level to introduce the who are they called, the Hammerites. Hammerites, that's what I thought, but it didn't sound right in my head. The Hammerites, and it also
that's because he didn't have a good voice in his head.
Yeah, exactly. No, my voice in my head is not a good voice, not anywhere near Garrett's. and just this sort of like onion layer of introducing this sort of faction that will come to play later. And because you start, the map in this one is a very different looking map for most of it than the other map, because you don't know so much. And we'll definitely need to talk a lot more about the map in future episodes. But you just get the sense that you're really going in an alternate route this time, and you're starting kind of in the, in these mines, and then you're working your way up, which is a very clear kind of level design flow for the player to understand. And then you're just every level / layer is unearthing new kind of things. And you get to the prison, and, just really fully realize, and you really kind of start to hate these guys, and see them as a really big threat, because they're really tough if you do ever engage with them. And there's alarms and all sorts of stuff. And then the other cool thing that I loved about this mission I remember being a nice surprise, is once you get to your first big objective, which is Cuddy. Cuddy, is that his name?
Yes, Cuddy. Mm-hmm. He owes you money.
He owes you money, but he actually he ends up dying. Spoiler for those who aren't playing along. And you get a new objective, essentially. And so it kind of they give you a little bit of a surprise moment there that that's kind of a refreshing thing, because it gives you a sense of Garrett kind of knows what he's doing every time, and he's fully in control of what he's trying to achieve and what he's trying to steal, and then they mix it up on you, and then you have to keep going higher in the sort of stack of levels. So yeah, it just was a cool location and I think introduction to this pretty important group and threat. So yeah, that's all I guess I had to say about that level. But
yeah, I really like that space. Although I had some trouble with the switches, getting the cage open or the door open for Cuddy. There was something weird going on there.
Super weird rules going on with those switches.
Something a little strange there, but I really have no idea. I finally flicked a bunch of them, and I was like, oh, now it's open. Okay, I kept going out in the hall and looking, is it open? It's weird. But yeah, no, it's a great moment where you have that sort of dynamic goal in a game that has so many dynamic systems. You also have dynamic goals, and it makes it feel alive in a way that more static and linear levels do not.
Yeah.
So it's that's a definite high point in the first couple levels that we played. All right, well, let's take a quick break, and then we'll be right back and hit a few pieces of feedback.
Sounds good.
Welcome back from the break. Each episode, we like to follow up with a little feedback if we have it, usually in the form of either reviews or emails. Reviews can go, of course, to the Apple Store, iPod, podcast app thing, whatever, iTunes, etc. We pay attention to all of those through various RSS feeds, and we should get them from around the world. And they do help us reach new listeners if you have a moment. 5-star review means the world to us. For the rest of you, you can shoot us email at devgameclub@gmail.com, where we have our first email from a Final Fantasy-inspired emailer. You want to go ahead with that one, sir?
Yeah. So we have... subject is Laura's Lovely Illuminated Ledges. From Gothic Chocobo. Hey, Brett and Tim. Firstly, links. Sorry for the video links, Brett. I know you are more into written articles. To a couple of videos relating to Lara Croft. I don't know if anything here is new to you, but it might provide a couple of talking points you might not have thought of initially. Question here, looks like the first link is the reboot of Lara Croft more feminist? And then the second link looks like to be 10 things women were doing in video games in the 1990s. Interesting. Okay, I did not watch those, so I don't know.
So we're not going to comment on those, but I will put the link in the show notes. Because now Now the next sentences.
Okay, now the main point of the email. While I'm not a games developer, I'm surprised that things like enabling, disabling edge highlights isn't a default option. I would have thought that it would be as simple as changing a transparency from 100 to 0%. The player switches that option on or off, but I guess the designs of the levels with edge markings would look fairly different to a level designed without edge markings. Along the same lines, I would love for games to give the player enough information so that the player could turn off the mini-map, quest markers, and the other stuff associated with following the dotted line, in quotes. Link below to Mark Brown's video on why Nathan Drake doesn't need a compass, and, in quotes, following the dotted lines for listeners. I know that removing the dotted line would probably cause a massive increase in level design, coding, dialogue writing, and recording, which could be hard to justify to producers when modern games are full of accessibility shortcuts we are familiar with. However, as a player, it would be nice to have new games come out with the depth of quest information from a game designed before the dotted line style of game, kind of like Morrowind, but with the option to turn on the accessibility options, making it more like the style Skyrim if the player wanted the help/guidance.
Yeah, you can skip over the links because those will be in the show notes as well.
Okay. And his final paragraph, I hope that as the young players grow into eager developers/designers, they are able to find a happy middle ground of visual clues, given information, and the option to enable or disable them to your liking. Many thanks, Gothic Chocobo.
Yeah, so the first one was the changing the transparency from 100% to 0%. Thanks for the email, Goth. It's actually, I think it's probably a little more complicated than that, because I guess normally you'd just be making them one way. You wouldn't have a separate layer of information that had the markings on it. They would just be the texture of that object, and there wouldn't be another one underneath. There's a good reason not to have them be transparent. You actually just want them to be different geometry or different texture, I suppose. And that means engineering infrastructure to know either not to load the other textures or to substitute in these new textures or what have you. So I don't, I think there is some real work there that is a little more complicated than it might initially seem. You definitely don't want two objects there all the time. You want to switch between one or the other, and probably that means a fair amount of just careful modeling to make them both look like they fit. So I think that technically speaking, it's not super straightforward. It's not super hard, but it's definitely not nothing. And of course, you have to do it to everything. All these places that Lara traverses in one of these games. So, yeah, I mean, because often you have to keep in mind that the white paint looks like it belongs there, and so you need it to make sense both ways. It needs to look right when it isn't there as well, and that's not necessarily straightforward.
Yeah,
you got any thoughts about the dotted line? You've played a lot of dotted line in what's it called, The Witcher 3. Right, that's a very dotted line game, literally. Right?
Yeah, there are missions, I think, that definitely. I mean, it's not as much a dotted line as much as they just tell you, because it's so open world, that they just tell you where the location is and you can get there. So yeah, there's not a lot of mystery, I think, often in where to go. But when they have dotted line kind of. And Batman does some of this too, when he's kind of like sleuthing his way, then yeah, they just give you footprints or a scent that you're following that's essentially dotted line. And of course, Dead Space is the ultimate example of that, that we always reference. Yeah, with the ledges really quick, the only thing I'd add is that, a lot of times through draw calls or what have you, textures tend to get baked down, even though the way they're constructed by artists is in multiple layers. So technically you could, think that through. But to Brett's point, anytime you're turning stuff on or off like that, you basically have to think it through from the beginning to some degree. You have to think about the repercussions in both. Same with the radar and the dotted lines of, the challenge, in my opinion, of stuff like that, especially in the accessibility side, is when it comes to player understanding about any given thing that you're trying to direct them toward in any fashion. It tends to be a combination of things that are sort of all intertwined. When you kind of do user testing on stuff, it's not as simple as, is the minimap on or off? Is the dotted line on or off? It's usually, things that are kind of interdependent upon each other. And so when you turn one of those things off, it usually impacts other things that are all reliant on that, unless you have thought through this stuff from the beginning. Not necessarily from the beginning, but as you're developing, you're thinking through what it means to turn these options on or off. And I think to his kind of macro question and point, I agree with him that we should be doing more of this all the time. I think every game should strive to do. That's why I was so excited about the Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I am still excited about what they're doing with Shadow. It does come down to some production realities, though, I think, because ultimately you want the most people to understand as much as possible about what to do in the game, and so you index toward that, and that's where you spend your resources. And anything beyond that, for options' sake, tends to be, cut or toned down for production reasons and doesn't get the priority that it needs. But I really wish that, to his point, that we did prioritize that stuff more. But sometimes time is time, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's definitely an issue. It's there's never enough time in game development. I mean, a lot of what crunch comes down to is that there's not enough time for all the things you want to do, even as a developer, as an individual contributor, and so you end up putting in more time to make those things a reality. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be nice to have that availability, but honestly, I could definitely, especially for some of these really big games, just wanting them turned on, just because. In something like Skyrim, I think I would have had a hard time. I mean, now I didn't often play it just following a quest line. I tended to, I guess early on, when I first started playing it in development, I played the Mages Guild, maybe. And I know I played the Thieves Guild at one point. But for games those big, I mean, I just tended to find the dungeons, go in, do the dungeon, come out, etc. So, yeah, I mean, I know it depends on the player. But also, I mean, the other thing too, to support your point is, I think one of the things that I really like about Skyrim and games that do have these sort of dotted lines is that there's still actually the opportunity to have your own self-directed sort of quests. You can just not mark any quest. And for me, that was, I want to find, let's see, what did I want to find? I want to find all the dragon priest masks in Skyrim. And in Fallout 3, I wanted to find all the bobbleheads. And those aren't things you can just get dotted line to. And I think that some of those sort of player directed stuff is where you have the opportunity to have non-directed play for the people who are really into it and just want to spend more time doing whatever kind of self-directed play. And again, to reach that wide market, you probably, for these very expensive to make games, you probably do want to help people as much as possible. So yeah, agree there. I think it's just because we're experienced gamers, old gamers, as it were, that we want the opposite. Anyway, moving on to movement weight from Romulus Santos, who says, hello, cheers from Brazil. Hola. Actually, I don't even know if they say that there because it's Portuguese, not Spanish. Anyway, this is my first time sending an email, and first I would like to congratulate you both for being great professionals, both as podcasters and game developers. I've played the games that you cited you worked on, and I also started listening since the Final Fantasy IX podcast, but I went back and listened to the previous ones also, and it shows that you guys really put your hearts into your work. Now to the topic at hand. During the Tomb Raider series of podcasts, you guys referenced how the character weight and animations bring a different depth to the experience, and I believe that this is taken further by the fact that the character has the perfect weight and the movements are not exaggerated. Lara's movements are easy to comprehend because they are so close to what we feel in real life, despite the fact that she pulls off some pretty impossible stuff. One great example of this is one of my favorite games, Monster Hunter. This is a very specific point that got me into Monster Hunter in the first place. You see an impossible weapon, and you think about how heavy it should be, and when you swing it, you feel the weight of that weapon every time. Not just that you can't cancel a move, so once you swing that weapon, you're committed to that movement. Not just that, but you can't cancel a move. There we go. These two aspects, when working alongside each other, makes it easier to connect to movements, otherwise thought impossible, by making them feel realistic. In Tomb Raider, when you try to jump a gap or a trap, you usually know how far you can go, even if the game doesn't clearly mark distances for you sometimes. In newer games, you can see sometimes when the game does a little correcting of your trajectory so the animation connects, despite you jumping kind of sideways to a ledge. Also, she feels so nimble sometimes that you feel lighter than you should be. Not that it detracts from the experience as a whole, but both the new and old Tomb Raider games have these moments that just pull you away from the game. Thank you for all your great work and keeping us entertained. Your line of work is one of bringing enjoyment to people, and it's awesome. Far better than what I do. Keep up the great work. Professional Hitman, Romulo Santos. No, I added the professional Hitman part.
Oh. Wow. That would have been awesome.
I was imagining him as a very tall, bald guy. Anyway, I haven't played any Monster Hunter. I don't know if you have. I know there was one out this year that got really good reviews back in
Monster Hunter World.
February, March, April, whatever, a while back.
Yeah, Monster Hunter World. I haven't played any of the previous ones, but the Monster Hunter World came out late on PC. It just came out in August, I believe, and that is the one that I have heavily, because of my MMO proclivities and things. That's one that I feel like I'd probably start playing on, and I've heard a lot of what he's saying from the diehards at work and stuff that I've interacted with, as far as like how it utilizes animation systems and such to keep that. It definitely seems impressive. I think it's probably a point we didn't hit either at all or very hard in the series, the previous series, that I think one of the things that resonated with me, at least in a world where there were a lot of platformers in that era, is the style of her animations and the sort of, at least at the time, just seemingly realistic feeling, you know what I mean? And just very relatable. And it just felt much more like you're there with her than any of the other more exaggerated games out there. And a lot of that is the weight. And though we weren't able to get him to commit to come on, I think that's a testament to Toby Gard's work. I believe he did a lot of the animation work on that. And that was an area of interest of his, as I understand it, knowing him as a friend, that kind of the weightiness and momentum of animation and animation systems was kind of just sort of one of his, I think, infatuations, if you will. And so I guess it makes a lot of sense that what he's saying in the email. So yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I have noticed, I've played more of the new game, and I've noticed in particular, and this is a specific solution, right, to a problem, is that because she goes into, because when you pull the bow and you basically target something in the environment, she basically immediately faces in that direction, and starts pulling it back, and that makes a lot of sense given what they're trying to do, and you want that sort of immediacy, but you've lost some of what the original Tomb Raider had, which was maybe even a little too much because she turned very slowly unless you did that sort of turn directly around move. Mm-hmm. So it's it's a really interesting thing. I mean, that is something that people often make funny videos about Skyrim about, is because the NPCs will often turn in that kind of weird way as well. which is for totally different reasons. But it is partly grounded in how the animation system works. So so you have these sort of trade-offs that you make for sure, trading that immediacy for more groundedness in that case. So, all right, one last one, I think, and then we'll call it a night, and we'll catch up with the other handful next time. This one's a good length and a decent topic as well, from Andrew.
Okay. Subject is observation, weapon role design, and Tomb Raider 2013, from Andrew Menger Ogle. Ogle, yeah. Menger Ogle. Dear Tim and Brett, first time, long time. Thank you. Your discussions of Deus Ex and Tomb Raider have got me thinking about weapon design. Let me give you my naive take on the topic, illustrate a concept with a Tomb Raider anecdote, and then hand it over for your thoughts. Topic thoughts. It seems to me that in video games with gun combat, the weapon design for a long time was just to start with weaker weapons and then add in more stronger weapons. Early FPSs like Duke Nukem 3D and Doom follow this pattern to the point that the first-person pistol became non-viable once you got later weapons. Halo was a paradigm shift because of its emphasis on each weapon having a distinct role. For example, many people preferred the pistol over the assault rifle because the zoom and accuracy were preferred over firing speed. No one would have made this choice in Doom. I think the two-weapon capacity supported this approach, along with dedicated buttons for grenades and an empowered melee attack. Later, weapon role design became the norm, and even third-person action-adventure games like Uncharted and Tomb Raider in 2013 adopted Halo's emphasis of weapon roles. Interestingly, the Tomb Raider reboot blew my mind, all in caps, by upsetting my expectations around the specific weapon roles. In that game, the designs hid the melee strike in the skill tree, and the act of which placed the pistol into a very realistic weapon role. Anecdote: in an early game encounter, I was trying to silently take out guards with a bow, in parentheses, a sniper weapon role, when things went south and the guards started rushing me. I hadn't unlocked the melee attack for close-range combat, so I had to use my pistols to take down the rushing guards. I desperately unloaded my clip and missed with half of the shots. This is how pistols are used in real life. They are lethal, semi-automatic, and close-range weapons. I had never seen a pistol used in this way because the punchy close-range attack is usually filled by shotguns or strong melee attacks. Tomb Raider eventually brings these two options on board as well, which results in the pistol becoming non-viable until you find a silencer for it later on. But even then, I still opted for the bow in stealth sequences most of the time. Your thoughts? I'd love to hear your take on the topic, especially Tim, since you've worked on Tomb Raider and the Halo series. Where is weapon design in the industry now, and where do you see it going? Is there a difference between weapon roles and weapon balance? Kudos to both of you on your career work and your podcast work. Andrew in Cincinnati. Oh, man. Oof.
Yeah, big topic. So we probably will not cover this in the depth that it really requires.
Yeah.
Because keep in mind that we spent many hours talking about this for Republic Commando, both together and with other people on the team. It was a whole thing. We had a small team that actually worked just on punching up the weapons and figuring out how they should be used and things like that. It's a big topic.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I guess I'll probably speak pretty broadly about it because, both in my day-to-day work as well as, the mechanical work on Tomb Raider was done by the team and other people and stuff, though, I can talk about maybe some of the role of the bow and the importance of the bow and how that kind of definitely, to his point, impacted the weapon roles for the rest of the game, because the emphasis was really supposed to be on the bow versus other things, and to kind of mix that stuff up for sure. But I will say that his question about, and he's right in that Halo And one of the reasons I was personally excited about going to work on the Halo series was some of those paradigm shifts that Bungie really started. And those orthogonal weapon designs were really key, I think, to the industry, both in the control set, as he mentioned, but also in just the way that they interact with the enemy set. And of course roles in multiplayer as well, but specifically about how all those things kind of interchange, and that sandbox those sandbox dependencies in Halo is really, really great. I think the interesting, I guess, conundrum that I feel like the industry is in with weapon roles right now, that I think a lot of games are struggling with finding the right balance on, and I'm definitely not going to name any names because I it's competitors or what have you, so I kind of want to be careful. But with the first thought that came to my mind is with the prevalence of progression models and loot, essentially, I'll boil it down to, and the concept of weapons as loot. It's hard to have your cake and eat it too when it comes to making sure something retains a really clear weapon role, but then also has some sort of progression and loot-driven escalation. Because like he said, with Halos, with the 2-weapon model, only being able to carry 2 weapons, the roles were able to stay pretty pure because you had to make an important decision when you ran out of ammo or you wanted to switch because you only had those 2 slots and you only could find the weapons that were on the ground. But in a world where you're keeping weapons around on your character or your player for a longer time, people want to kind of keep that weapon around longer, and it may be a sniper rifle, but it may not be exactly the role that they want. But it also has ways you can upgrade it and modify it and all this sort of stuff. It's kind of 2 things are fighting each other, I guess I'll say, you know what I mean? Because it's like you're blurring the lines a little bit and maybe watering down the weapon role a little bit because you want this player to not have to throw the weapon away because they're committing all this time to this weapon that they found, and so I think that's not really I don't really have a good prediction there. I just am kind of pointing out an interesting modern challenge that weapon roles, I think, are facing right now, because we want people to be invested in their weapons because it's kind of a new form of loot and gear that you get, but also we want them to retain their roles. And I think those 2 things are a little bit in conflict sometimes, especially if there's a lot of RPG elements in the game. So that's one random thought that comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, I want to. I don't know Duke Nukem 3D particularly well. I haven't played very much of that game, but Doom, I think definitely, and Doom 2 do actually have weapon roles. And if you watch somebody really accomplished play those games, they can start at the level with the pistol, and there's actually just a natural progression built in through the level design that makes the weapons that you pick up make sense in the short term. And I think it's down to players who don't do that. I mean, if you watch John Romero play Doom, which I have, it's extraordinary. Number one, how good he is, but also just he knows exactly what he's going to do with every weapon when he picks it up. I'm going to use it for this. I'm going to switch to this when I pick it up and go kill these things. And the levels are built around that, and you can start with the pistol and you're totally fine. I do think one of the things that changed, and it was something we talked about on Republic Commando, was making all the weapons feel good as soon as you pick them up. When you use them, you shouldn't feel like the pistol is an inferior weapon. Its advantage was, of course, it was recharging. It never ran out of ammo, so you always had that as a fallback. That was kind of its strength. I don't really know if it was useful, and I think it had a pretty good kill. Like it was pretty effective at melee, because all of our weapons had melee attacks instead of using the knife. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I don't know where I was going with that, but I think that one of the things that I think was a shift in design, as he pointed out, was you started out with this weapon and it was weak, and you wanted to get rid of it and get to something better as soon as possible. It was an early feeling of accomplishment. I think the shift to in Tomb Raider 2013, for example, of having that bow be effectively, I mean, the weapon you could use the whole game, which I mostly did, was a really interesting one. And I particularly like the model where weapons feel like an extension of the character, and less like a constant wish fulfillment of just like, oh, now I get to use this fancy, gun that I've read about, it's this real thing, and I mod it 600 billion different ways, just like you could a real, I don't know, AR-15 or something like that. I mean, part of that is that I want, in these sorts of games, I tend to actually want to feel like I'm playing a different specific person, and in sort of an action adventure context, and having just a million weapons that I can pick up and use kind of interchangeably really works against that for me. So I really like the model where, and I've talked about this before, where I tend to just use whatever the character's distinctive weapon is all the time. That's just what I do when I play games as much as possible. We've mentioned Dead Space with that art, was it called the arc cutter or something like that?
Fusion cutter? Or?
Fusion cutter, yeah, it could be. Yeah. Anyway, that cutting laser, I used that everywhere as much as I could in that game, and I might have actually done. I think they even had an achievement for that. Just use the game that only in the whole game, and I did that. And that tends to be my preference, because it when well designed, those feel like a real extension of what your world building is trying to do. With Lara, she makes this thing, right? She makes it out of I guess what she finds around in the environment, and although that's something that's kind of ongoing throughout the game, it definitely has that moment of like, oh, I made my bow, cool. It's a great thing. And as the series has progressed, of course, they add lots of different types of bows and things like that, and that's kind of fine, because I don't really look at that stuff. It's like, well, I'm just using a different set of stats on this kind of central weapon. But yeah, for me, that's anything that reinforces your narrative in your sort of third person action adventure, or even first person shooter at times, I think is a good thing. So anyway,
it's a good topic. Definitely food for thought. And it's a deep, hard one too. And it really has a lot to do with your goals for the game you're talking about too. And he cites a bunch of examples that I would say have different goals, in various ways when it comes to what to do with weapons. So, but I think, to his point about the early games versus whether it's Halo specifically or the games around that time that started shifting the model, I think weapons is just one example that probably every system and mechanic set probably has gone through this. We probably could think of some other examples if we thought about it hard enough. Where just escalation from a power fantasy perspective, we kind of realized and discovered wasn't ultimately the most interesting thing. And, the creating interesting choices for players to make, and hard choices, as Sid Meier would say, is really a more interesting way for a game to be designed than just picking the most obvious next most powerful weapon or movement, option or vehicle or whatever, you know what I mean? And kind of having all those things be different, take on different roles, I think just became a discovery for all of us around, in various ways, not just weapons, because, it's kind of emergently more interesting for the player to make that decision. And to your point about John playing through Doom, picking the right thing in their mind for the situation, and not everything being the right thing for every situation. Right. So I think it's kind of just more interesting choice space in general.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Anyway,
definitely.
Yeah, good one.
Yeah, definitely a great topic, and
thanks for writing in.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, for sure. And also to Romula and Goth Chocobo, who we have another email for next time, and also ones from Björn and Tim Dorr, who we'll read those next time. because we're starting to go long. Thanks so much for sending those in to devgameclub@gmail.com. Quick talk about next time. I think we're going to go 4 levels this time because it's going to make sense to do 5 the time after that. And you'll see why at that point. But we're going to go up through the sword. That is I think that's when you meet Constantine. He has this sword, I believe.
Through the sword, so finish the sword, you're saying?
Finish the sword, yeah. That's 4 levels worth.
Okay.
Because it'll make sense to do the next 5. There's some nice bookends that'll make a lot of sense. So yeah, we'll keep playing Thief next week, unless anything else comes together in the meantime. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at DevGameClub. You can also find Mr. Tim Longo there at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
And I am gone from Twitter, but I have actually returned as of today to Twitch occasionally. You can find me on twitch.tv/Brett Duville, which I was just going to check. I can't remember. I think it's, I have to see, no underscore. So just Brett Duville, my name straight through. Yeah, so we will talk to you next week on the cast. Thanks everyone again for your emails. And for now, I guess have fun playing games this week. Good night.
Good night.